On the very day of his release, he was deliberately made difficult by the warden. The warden demanded that he alone carry a mast weighing 1,000 pounds as proof of his last day of labor, strictly forbidding anyone else from helping. This was a task that was difficult for an ordinary person to complete, but fortunately, he was incredibly strong. He gritted his teeth and struggled to lift the mast, then laboriously moved it in front of the warden. Just when Jean Valjean thought he was about to regain his freedom, he discovered that the parole certificate clearly labeled him as a highly dangerous person. What shocked him even more was the warden's stern warning that he must regularly report to the nearby police station, and failure to do so would result in his arrest and imprisonment again. This meant that this mark of shame would accompany him for life. Hearing this, Jean Valjean felt both indignant and wronged. 19 years ago, he was sentenced to imprisonment for stealing a loaf of bread to save his starving nephew, spending a full 19 years in this dark prison. Little did he expect that even after his release, he would not be free or liberated for the rest of his life. Such harsh laws were truly against the principles of justice. However, Warden Javert regarded such laws as the supreme truth. At the time of parting, Javert again sternly warned Jean Valjean to strictly adhere to the law. Despite Jean Valjean's deep resentment, he could only silently accept the heavy parole order and then leave this place that had left a lasting mark on him. After crossing the cold and treacherous Alps, he arrived at an unfamiliar town. However, that parole order became an inescapable shackle, causing him to face repeated setbacks in his job search. Even young children would throw stones at him, insulting and mocking him maliciously. When he went to an inn at night, pleading with the owner to allow him to rest in the stable for one night, he was roughly expelled, fearing that he would tarnish their establishment. In hunger and cold, he had no place to shelter and could only sleep on the ground in front of a church. However, just as he fell asleep, he was awakened by a priest. The priest had a kind face, not only inviting him inside, but also providing him with hot food. Seeing Jean Valjean devour the food without praying, a nearby nun showed a look of disgust, which made Jean Valjean feel uncomfortable. Unexpectedly, the priest's attitude was exceptionally gentle. At that moment, he had already suffered the hardships of the world and no longer believed that there was still goodness in the world, thus assuming the priest must have ulterior motives. So, while the priest was asleep, he stole all the silverware from the church. However, he had not escaped far when he was caught by patrolling officers. This time, he feared he would spend the rest of his life in prison. To his surprise, the priest not only did not blame him, but instead falsely claimed that all these items were gifts from him, even handing him the 2 most valuable candlesticks, saying he had forgotten to take them. The priest's actions left Jean Valjean astonished, and the police officer could no longer pursue the matter. After the police left, the priest's gaze revealed deep compassion and understanding. He earnestly advised Jean Valjean in a solemn tone to view all these circumstances as divine arrangements and encouraged him to make good use of the silverware to start a new life and become a sincere and kind person. May God guide Jean Valjean out of the dark abyss and save this suffering soul. Upon hearing the priest's teachings, Jean Valjean knelt down and fell into deep contemplation. He began to sincerely confess to God. 19 years of imprisonment had tormented him, and after his release, he faced discrimination and humiliation from the world. He had resolved to hate the entire world with a heart of stone, but at that moment, he met the priest. The priest's kindness and generosity deeply touched Jean Valjean, instantly softening his already cold heart. Jean Valjean could no longer suppress his emotions and wept aloud. Thus, he vowed to completely change his ways. Then, he resolutely tore up the parole certificate that symbolized shame, determined to face the world anew with a new identity. 8 years passed in the blink of an eye, and it was now 1823. Under the shadow of the monarchy, the French king imposed heavy taxes, and the lower classes suffered greatly. The streets of Paris were filled with beggars who could not fill their stomachs. At this time, Jean Valjean had changed his name and, using the silverware gifted by the priest as startup capital, not only operated a textile factory with hundreds of employees, but also served as the mayor of Montreuil, a suburb of Paris. Over the years, he had always remembered the priest's teachings, adhering to kindness and integrity, and thus earned the heartfelt respect of all his employees. Jean Valjean thought his peaceful life would continue like this. However, a twist of fate came unexpectedly. His former prison warden Javert was transferred to the area. During a meeting with the newly appointed Inspector Javert in his office, Jean Valjean, as mayor, sensed that although this subordinate appeared respectful, his eyes revealed undeniable doubt. Javert always felt that the mayor's face was familiar, but he could not confirm it for a moment. At that moment, a cry for help suddenly rang out in the street. A transport cart had unfortunately overturned, and the driver was trapped underneath, in grave danger. In a critical moment, Jean Valjean once again displayed incredible strength. He single-handedly lifted the cart, which weighed over 1,000 pounds, successfully rescuing the trapped driver. However, this feat shocked Inspector Javert, who was present. Over the years, he had only seen one person possess such divine strength. and that was the convict Jean Valjean, who 8 years ago could lift a 1,000-pound mast with his bare hands. That person had mysteriously disappeared 8 years ago. Javert developed strong suspicions about the true identity of this mayor. After returning to the police station, he immediately submitted a report to the Paris police headquarters. That evening, while patrolling the streets as part of his routine, Inspector Javert unexpectedly witnessed a woman on the street having a heated argument with a man. A man pointed to the scratches on his face, accusing a woman of attacking him without cause. Javert decided to arrest the woman without further inquiry. No matter how the woman defended herself, Javert determined her guilt solely based on what he had seen. In his eyes, these street women were always full of lies. He immediately announced a sentence of 1 year of hard labor for the woman. Just then, Jean Valjean passed by and recognized that the woman was his former factory employee, Fantine. He could not understand how the once beautiful Fantine had fallen to such a state. However, Fantine showed anger and harshly accused Jean Valjean of being the cause of all this. The young and beautiful Fantine had become pregnant before marriage, but was cruelly abandoned by her lover after the birth of her daughter. To support her young daughter, she had to work in a textile factory. To protect her daughter's reputation, she entrusted the child to a tavern owner in Montfermeil and insisted on sending monthly support payments. However, the truth could not be hidden forever. Despite her efforts to conceal it, this secret was discovered by other female workers who were jealous of her beauty. They quickly banded together to spread rumors and maliciously slander Fantine. In her anger, Fantine confronted them, causing the originally orderly factory to descend into chaos. Hearing the commotion, Jean Valjean intended to handle the matter, but before he could inquire about the reason, the newly appointed Javert had already arrived. Faced with this former enemy, he felt a jolt of anxiety. Eager to deal with Javert, he had no time to address the situation and left it to the foreman to handle. Unexpectedly, the foreman, who had long pursued Fantine without success, felt deceived upon learning that she had a child, and thus revealed the darkest side of his humanity, mocking her to the fullest, and then secretly expelling her from the factory without informing Jean Valjean. Meanwhile, the greedy tavern owner and his wife, in order to extort more money, falsely claimed that Fantine's daughter was seriously ill and urgently needed a large sum for medical expenses. To save her beloved daughter, she was forced to go to the black market and pawn her only jewelry. However, even so, the amount she received was still far from enough to cover the required expenses. Subsequently, under the temptation of black market merchants, Fantine first sold her long hair and then sold 2 of her teeth. In the end, left with nothing, she had to become a street prostitute. However, the man who had just tried to force himself on her without paying attempted to assault her after she refused. In the struggle, Fantine accidentally scratched his face. Upon learning all this, Jean Valjean felt deep guilt. He had not anticipated that his indifference would cause such profound suffering to an innocent woman, so he immediately picked up the battered Fantine, disregarding Javert's obstruction, insisting on taking her to the hospital for treatment in hopes of making amends for past mistakes. The next morning, Javert received a reply from the Paris headquarters. Upon learning that the parole violator Jean Valjean, who had escaped years ago, had been captured and would be publicly tried the next day, this law-abiding detective suddenly realized his previous misjudgment. He immediately went to Jean Valjean's office to apologize in person. Surprisingly, Jean Valjean did not blame him, but only urged him to perform his duties with peace of mind. Although Javert felt relieved, he was overwhelmed with respect and gratitude towards the mayor. After Javert left, Jean Valjean found himself in an unprecedented dilemma. If he chose to turn himself in at that moment, all his efforts over the years would be in vain, and the hundreds of female workers under him would lose their jobs due to the factory's closure, possibly repeating Fantine's tragic fate. If he chose to evade, the innocent man who resembled him would suffer the torture and possibly pay with his life. Just as he was unable to decide and felt torn, he inadvertently caught sight of the candlestick that the priest had given him years ago. The faint candlelight flickered in the darkness, as if telling the truth of redemption. This made him suddenly realize, redeeming others is like this candlelight, needing the redeemed to generously pass on the light. So he drove to the court overnight and publicly admitted that he was the real fugitive Jean Valjean. However, the judges found it hard to believe that this well-dressed mayor could be a wanted criminal. In the end, he could only throw down the words, "If you don't believe, you can summon Javert to the hospital for questioning," and then hurriedly left the court. In the hospital bed, Fantine's life force was already as weak as a candle flickering in the wind. In a daze, she seemed to see her daughter Cosette approaching her, and she struggled to reach out her trembling arms, but ultimately could not touch Cosette's small figure. She had come to terms with the arrival of death, with only Cosette being her sole concern in this world. Only when Jean Valjean solemnly promised to protect Cosette and ensure her healthy growth did Fantine reveal a relieved smile. In the end, she peacefully closed her eyes, bidding farewell to this world that had given her endless suffering. Just then, Javert, having received the news, also rushed to the hospital. He immediately drew his sword, intending to block Jean Valjean's path. Jean Valjean pleaded with Javert for a 3-day grace period, promising to turn himself in after he settled Fantine's daughter. However, the upright Javert turned a deaf ear to this. In his eyes, it was merely an excuse for Jean Valjean to escape. The two sides fought fiercely for several rounds. Unable to determine a victor, worried about Cosette's safety, Jean Valjean, disinterested in fighting, took advantage of Javert's unpreparedness to push open the window and leap down, escaping by waterway. Not long after, Jean Valjean found the frail Cosette in a shabby tavern. Upon learning more, he was shocked to discover that the young Cosette had been living a miserable life of hunger for a long time. It turned out that the couple running the tavern were inherently cruel and ruthless. They treated their own daughter like a precious jewel while treating Cosette like a slave. Even in the harsh winter, Cosette could only wear a thin, tattered garment. Even more infuriating was that the couple often forced her to go alone to the woods at night to fetch water, and would beat her at the slightest displeasure. Upon learning all this, Jean Valjean was filled with righteous indignation and immediately decided to pay the exorbitant price of 1,500 francs to redeem this poor girl's freedom. He then gave Cosette a beautiful doll and solemnly promised to be her father from then on, providing her with meticulous care no matter where they were. The young Cosette seemed to have found support, her eyes shimmering with tears as she nestled tightly in Jean Valjean's embrace. This made Jean Valjean feel a sense of happiness he had never experienced before. The feeling of being needed moved him deeply, as if the suffering he had endured in the past no longer mattered at that moment. For a time, he did not know whether he had saved Cosette from her bleak life or whether Cosette had saved his long-standing loneliness. At that moment, his world was filled with hope and light again. However, just as they were about to leave the city, Javert, who had been waiting for a long time, set up heavy checkpoints at the city gate, vowing to capture Jean Valjean. Seeing this, Jean Valjean decisively took Cosette and fled the carriage. In a hurry, the two escaped to the outside of a church, just as Javert rode up quickly. In a critical moment, they climbed up to the eaves with the help of a rope to avoid capture. Once they confirmed that Javert had left, they climbed down from the eaves and fled again. Not long after, they encountered an old man who was sweeping the street. Before Jean Valjean could ask for help, the old man recognized him at a glance. It turned out that this old man was the one who had been trapped by the carriage that day. To repay the life-saving grace, the old man quickly hid the two without hesitation. With the old man's help, they successfully escaped Javert's pursuit. Javert, who had missed another opportunity, was furious and looked up at the starry sky, silently vowing, no matter where he had to go, even if he had to tread through the underworld, he would definitely capture Jean Valjean to uphold justice. In the blink of an eye, it was now 1832, 9 years later Haiti that time in France. Class contradictions were becoming increasingly sharp. The lower class was living in dire straits, while the nobility continued to live in luxury and indulgence. The public's dissatisfaction had reached its peak, and the wave of revolution was rapidly sweeping across the country. As a young revolutionary, Marius resolutely stepped forward with a group of like-minded young people, raising his arms among the lower class and calling on the people to overthrow the monarchical autocracy and jointly create a new era of democratic republic. In this turbulent situation, Marius encountered Cosette in the crowd. She was as beautiful and captivating as a blooming flower, bringing warmth and care to the poor alongside Jean Valjean on the street. Cosette inherited her mother Fantine's unparalleled beauty, which deeply captivated Marius at first sight. The unpredictability of life brought back the cunning tavern couple. Their greedy nature was evident, and they soon targeted Jean Valjean, who was giving alms, believing that the ransom paid to redeem Cosette was too low and intending to continue extorting him. Just as the two sides were arguing, that faithful man also appeared. Jean Valjean sensed danger and immediately fled with Cosette. Witnessing the sudden disappearance of the girl he loved, Marius fell into a state of extreme anxiety. In desperation, he had to seek information from his well-connected friend, Éponine, the tavern owner's daughter. However, he was completely unaware that Éponine secretly harbored feelings for him. Although she was reluctant in her heart, faced with her beloved's earnest request, the soft-hearted Éponine ultimately agreed. Late at night, a group of protesting youths gathered under dim light to discuss the timing and strategy of the uprising. However, only Marius was restless, his thoughts constantly occupied by the image of Cosette. His companions seemed to sense his unease and solemnly warned him. Overthrowing the monarchical autocracy was no child's play. In front of the oppressed working masses, that fleeting romance was far less significant than the pursuit of freedom and ideals. Just at that moment, Éponine suddenly appeared. She had successfully found out Cosette's exact address. Upon hearing this, Marius immediately rushed out the door. On the other side, Cosette, who had just escaped home with Jean Valjean, was filled with confusion. She could not understand why Jean Valjean had been fleeing with her all these years. However, Jean Valjean was always unwilling to reveal the true reason to her. Under Cosette's repeated questioning, the two had a fierce argument. Disturbed, Cosette went out alone to clear her mind and happened to meet Marius, who was looking for her. In the hazy moonlight, the two felt a mutual understanding and then expressed their feelings across the fence. This scene left Eponine, who was hiding nearby, heartbroken. She felt both comforted for Marius, who had found true love, and saddened by her unrequited love. However, the three of them were unaware that a crisis was quietly approaching. Eponine's father suddenly arrived with a group, clearly intending to seize Jean Valjean's property. When Eponine realized her father's intentions, she, with good intentions, shouted out a warning to stop her father's despicable actions. This sudden scream immediately alerted Jean Valjean, who mistakenly thought it was Javert leading the police to pursue him, and quickly fled again with Cosette. In the rush, Cosette hung a letter on the door, hoping it would be discovered by her beloved. However, this letter was taken by Eponine. Out of jealousy, she did not pass the letter on to Marius in time. Cosette's sudden departure left the lovesick Marius puzzled. Disheartened, he transformed his sorrow and anger into strength, pouring all his passion into the upcoming revolutionary cause. The next day, the youth clashed fiercely with the soldiers again. Both sides were at a stalemate, and tensions were high. After a brief turmoil, the youth were forced to retreat to a street corner. Local residents rushed to help them build defensive works at the intersection. During the chaos, Inspector Javert infiltrated the crowd, attempting to gather intelligence. However, his suspicious behavior was immediately recognized by the vigilant Gavroche. Javert was promptly detained by the crowd and tightly bound. As night fell, the army suddenly launched a fierce attack on the block. Faced with the well-trained soldiers, these young students bravely resisted but were still outmatched. As the defense line was about to collapse, Marius resolutely picked up a barrel of gunpowder, intending to perish with the enemy. The panicked officer had no choice but to lead his soldiers in a hasty retreat. In the earlier fierce conflict, Eponine, to protect Marius, took a fatal bullet for him. In her dying moments, she solemnly handed the letter from Cosette that she had tightly held to Marius. Although Eponine had once harbored jealousy, at this moment she displayed selflessness and bravery. Her act of sacrificing for love shocked Marius and everyone present. Marius sensed that he was about to follow in Eponine's footsteps to the afterlife, and he wrote a heartfelt farewell letter to Cosette. However, this letter unexpectedly fell into Jean Valjean's hands. He knew well that this young man possessed extraordinary charm and could very likely take his daughter away from him. At the same time, he also realized that if he stood by and did nothing, Marius would surely fall into danger, even losing his life in that dark night. After much contemplation, Jean Valjean ultimately decided to go alone to rescue Marius in order to spare Cosette the pain of losing her beloved. Jean Valjean donned a soldier's uniform and cleverly broke through the defenses, but was mistaken for the enemy by the students due to his unknown identity, and he was disarmed. At that moment, a soldier suddenly launched an attack from the rooftop. Fortunately, Jean Valjean reacted swiftly, resolving the crisis in time, not only repelling the enemy, but also dispelling the students' doubts. Upon seeing the bound Javert, he requested the students to let him handle Javert. He then took Javert to a secluded alleyway. In the pitch-black night, he drew the dagger from his waist. Just when Javert thought he was about to meet his end, Jean Valjean decisively cut the ropes binding him. Unexpectedly, the freed Javert showed no gratitude, instead revealing a tone of sarcasm. He declared contemptuously that once a thief, always a thief, and that Jean Valjean should not expect leniency in exchange for his act of release. Faced with Javert's blunt statement, Jean Valjean showed no sign of regret in his eyes. He calmly told Javert that releasing him came with no conditions. Jean Valjean understood that Javert was merely doing his duty, and thus had never harbored resentment towards him. Javert firmly believed that only the law could punish evil, while Jean Valjean attempted to win him over with kindness. Perhaps the true tragedy in the world is not the opposition between right and wrong, but the irreconcilable conflict between two equally legitimate beliefs. As time passed, everyone was immersed in the long wait before the final battle. They sang in unison, extolling the noble values of freedom and life. However, on this stalemate battlefield, a sudden downpour soaked all the ammunition, further worsening the already precarious defenses. At this moment, only a dozen students remained steadfast within the defenses. Having lost the support of the people, they fell deeper into isolation. Faced with the bleak hope of victory, doubts inevitably arose in everyone's hearts. In such a perilous situation, Gavroche stepped forward in a completely different manner. Despite being filled with fear, he sang an inspiring song, resolutely walking towards the enemy's guns. Though Gavroche was not physically imposing, he embodied the true meaning of life with his passionate spirit. Before his song could finish, his great soul had already transcended. Then, the soldiers witnessed the tragic scene before them and urged the youths to surrender to save their lives. However, they shouted in unison, declaring that even if the entire army were to be wiped out, there would still be successors to continue the fight. With the commander's order, the soldiers pushed the artillery to the front lines. Thus, both sides engaged in the final battle. However, the youth's defenses were quickly breached by the enemy's fierce assault, and the brave students fell one after another, igniting the flame of revolution with their lives. Witnessing the tragic scene, Jean Valjean had already foreseen this outcome. He swiftly carried the severely injured Marius and used the sewer system as an escape route, successfully evading the enemy's pursuit. This was the famous June uprising in French history, a tragedy interwoven with courageous resistance and twists of fate. After the battle, the entire street was in ruins, littered with the bodies of soldiers. When Javert was ordered to clear the battlefield, the scene in the back alley was equally shocking. He paused before Gavroche's body, and at that moment, the scale of justice he had upheld for many years began to waver. Those soldiers and officers, who were sacred and inviolable in his heart, had not even spared a child like this. At the same time, he expressed deep respect for the bravery and fearlessness that Gavroche had shown. In the end, Javert solemnly presented the badge he took pride in to this young hero who had bravely sacrificed himself at the age of 12. However, after the brief moment of silence ended, he immediately noticed that Jean Valjean's figure was not among the bodies of the victims. After multiple searches, he finally discovered an open sewer entrance. This sign seemed to indicate that Jean Valjean was still alive. He immediately deduced Jean Valjean's possible whereabouts. Deep in the dark, damp sewer, Jean Valjean unexpectedly encountered the tavern owner who was scavenging the bodies for valuables. Under the guidance of this tavern owner, he ultimately found an exit to the surface. However, unexpectedly, Javert had been waiting there for a long time. This familiar scene felt like a lifetime ago, as if the events of 20 years earlier were replaying, the unforgettable figure lingering in his mind. Jean Valjean had to once again plead with Javert for an hour's grace to properly settle Marius. However, Javert resolutely refused his request. Jean Valjean said no more, picked up Marius, and walked straight past Javert. Until his figure completely merged into the darkness, Javert never pulled the trigger. After Jean Valjean left, Javert's heart experienced an unprecedented turmoil. This law enforcer, known for his iron-faced impartiality, was unexpectedly moved by the mercy shown by a criminal. What made it even harder for him to accept was that due to his own indecision, he had let this criminal go right before his eyes. The belief he had upheld all his life, that there was only black and white, only good and evil, seemed to blur at that moment. Thus, he began to fall into deep reflection. Was there a higher truth beyond the justice he pursued? Javert has always adhered to the power of punishment as his creed. Is it really less important than the power of forgiveness? This intense inner struggle made it impossible for Javert to calmly examine the true meaning of this chaotic world. Ultimately, caught deeper and deeper in the whirlpool of moral faith, he could neither confront his own humanity nor achieve his own rebirth. In the end, like a martyr, he leaped into the Seine, ending his life, buried in the dust of the world, in the loneliest way. From that day on, Marius gradually awakened from a deep coma, thanks to the careful treatment of the Dr. Jean Valjean had invited, allowing him to preserve his life. However, the devastated city and the bloodstains left by fallen comrades plunged him into indescribable pain. The torment of surviving alone in the world without facing life and death with his comrades was an immense struggle and misfortune. Fortunately, he met Cosette again, and this reunion rekindled his courage and hope to continue living. Witnessing the happiness of the two young people, Jean Valjean knew that it was time to let go. He had fulfilled his promise to Fantine by raising Cosette to adulthood, and Cosette had finally found her lifelong love. When Jean Valjean realized that someone could replace him in protecting Cosette, he actively sought out Marius and solemnly entrusted Cosette to him. Then, Jean Valjean candidly revealed his unbearable past to Marius. As a fugitive, he could not continue to be by their side. If he were captured and imprisoned in the future, it would tarnish Cosette's reputation and affect her life. Jean Valjean repeatedly implored Marius never to reveal these past events to Cosette, and Marius gladly agreed. In the end, with a sense of grievance and heartache that no one understood, Jean Valjean left his daughter in sorrow. Unable to find Jean Valjean, Cosette wept all day, but with Marius's gentle comfort, she gradually calmed her emotions. Soon, this pair of lovers, who were in love with each other, tied the knot amidst laughter and joy. However, during the celebration, an unwelcome pair, the sinister tavern couple, arrived uninvited. For their own benefit, the tavern owner falsely claimed that he had saved Marius from danger. However, after several tests from Marius, their lies fell apart, and the truth finally came to light. It was Jean Valjean who had truly lent a helping hand that night. Upon learning the truth, Marius felt deeply ashamed and filled with regret, realizing how absurd his previous misunderstandings and neglect of Jean Valjean had been. Awakening to this realization, he immediately took his wife Cosette to the convent, vowing to find this lifesaver. At this moment, the ailing Jean Valjean was sincerely confessing to God. He gazed for a long time at the silver candlestick given to him by the priest, praying for forgiveness for a lifetime of sins and wishing that Cosette could have a happy and fulfilling life. In the past, he had not understood the true meaning of love until he personally raised Cosette to adulthood, realizing that love is about fulfillment. In a daze, Jean Valjean seemed to see Fantine coming to welcome him to heaven. However, his concern for Cosette made it difficult for him to close his eyes. At that moment, a voice calling Papa awakened Jean Valjean from his thoughts. The hurriedly arriving Cosette and Marius knelt before him, tightly holding his hands and unwilling to let go. Knowing that his life was coming to an end, he urged the young couple to love each other, support one another, and spend the rest of their lives together. In his final moments, Jean Valjean solemnly handed a letter to his daughter. This letter contained the entire journey of how a man emerged from the abyss of hatred and ultimately learned to love through adopting Cosette. He instructed Cosette to open it only after his passing. When Fantine's apparition reappeared, Jean Valjean's soul departed peacefully.